When 12 gold-laden stagecoaches arrive at the doorstep of Ezra Blackwood, a broken miner who hasn't spoken since a cave-in killed 17 men under his watch, he's forced to confront whether redemption can be found in the very darkness that destroyed him. Can a man who lost his voice in the depths of a mine find it again while protecting a fortune that could save the families of those he failed? A scream tore through the Montana morning, but it came from inside Ezra Blackwood's own throat. He jerked awake on the floor of his cabin, sweat coating his skin like mountain dew. The nightmare always ended the same way, 17 voices calling his name from beneath tons of rock, getting quieter and quieter until only silence remained. His hand flew to his throat, feeling the rope-thick scar that ran from ear to collarbone. No sound came out when he tried to speak. It never did anymore. The year was 1867, and the Montana Territory stretched wild and lawless beyond his cracked window. 3 winters had passed since the cave-in at Prospector's Gulch, but Ezra still woke each day, expecting to hear the clang of pickaxes and the cheerful cursing of miners heading to work. Instead, he heard only wind whistling through the bones of a dead town. He pulled himself up from the wooden floor, his joints protesting like rusty hinges. At 42, he moved like a man twice his age. The mirror above his wash basin showed a stranger's face, hollow cheeks covered by an unkempt beard, eyes the color of winter sky, hair gone gray at the temples. He looked away quickly. Mirrors held too much truth. Outside, the abandoned buildings of Prospector's Gulch stood like broken teeth against the morning sky. The general store's sign hung by one nail, creaking in the breeze. Tumbleweeds had claimed Main Street, rolling between the empty saloon and the boarded-up church. Even the cemetery looked lonely, its wooden crosses tilting at sad angles. Ezra shuffled to his kitchen table, where a cold cup of coffee waited. He'd poured it yesterday morning but never drank it. Food had lost its taste after the accident. Coffee had lost its warmth. Everything worthwhile had died in that mine shaft, along with 17 good men. He tried to remember what day it was but couldn't. Days blended together when you had nowhere to go and no one to see. The calendar on his wall still showed April 1864, the month everything changed. He'd never bothered turning the page. A tin can sat on the table, filled with coins that clinked when the wind shook the cabin. Money from selling his mining equipment piece by piece. Soon there would be nothing left to sell except the cabin itself. Maybe that would be for the best. Maybe it was time to move on. Find some place where people didn't know his name or what he'd done. The wooden chair groaned as he sat down. Everything in the cabin was falling apart, just like him. The roof leaked when it rained. The door didn't close right. The floorboard sagged in the middle. But fixing things required caring, and caring hurt too much. He picked up a piece of paper from the table, a letter that had arrived 2 weeks ago. The postal worker had ridden all the way from Helena just to deliver it, which meant it was important. But Ezra hadn't opened it. Important things usually brought bad news, and he'd had enough of that to last several lifetimes. The letter bore an official seal from the territorial government. Maybe they wanted taxes. Maybe they wanted him to testify at another hearing about mining safety. Maybe they wanted to blame him again for what happened to those 17 families. He set it aside and stared out the window instead. A hawk circled overhead, riding the morning thermals with lazy grace. Ezra envied its freedom. Hawks didn't carry guilt or regret. They didn't wake up screaming. They didn't have to live with the weight of other people's trust. He'd been the mine foreman at Prospector's Gulch, responsible for keeping men safe underground. The miners trusted him to know when timber supports were weak, when gas pockets might explode, when the mountain was getting ready to shift and settle. For 5 years, he'd never lost a single man. His safety record was perfect. Until it wasn't. The memory tried to surface, but he pushed it down like always. Some things were too heavy to carry in daylight. He saved his ghosts for dreams, where they belonged. A scratching sound came from outside, probably a raccoon looking for scraps. Ezra had stopped putting out food for the animals months ago. Even the wildlife avoided his cabin now, sensing something broken about the place. Or maybe they sensed something broken about him. He opened the letter without thinking, his fingers working while his mind wandered. The official language was hard to understand, full of big words and legal terms. But one phrase jumped out at him. Compensation for families of deceased miners. His hands began to shake. The letter was signed by someone named Margaret Calloway, representing the Territorial Mining Safety Commission. She wrote about gold being set aside for families of men who died in unsafe mines. She mentioned specific names: Samuel Torres, Benjamin Walsh, Patrick O'Brien, names that haunted his dreams. At the bottom of the letter, she'd written something in her own handwriting. Mr. Blackwood, we need your help. These families deserve justice, and you're the only one we trust to make sure they get it. Trust. The word hit him like a physical blow. He crumpled the letter and threw it across the room, but the words stayed in his head. 17 families. 17 widows and fatherless children. While he sat in his cabin feeling sorry for himself, they were struggling to survive without the men he'd failed to protect. A sound outside made him freeze, the distant rumble of wagon wheels on hard-packed earth. No one came to Prospector's Gulch anymore. The road was too rough, the town too dead. But the sound was getting closer, accompanied by the jingle of harness and the snorting of horses. Ezra moved to his window and peered through the dirty glass. Dust clouds rose from the valley road below, kicked up by something big moving fast. His heart began to race for the first time in months. Visitors meant questions meant talking. And talking was impossible when your voice had been crushed along with your spirit. The rumbling grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls like approaching thunder. Multiple wagons by the sound of it, maybe a dozen or more. Who traveled in such large groups? Merchants? Soldiers? Or something else entirely? He ducked away from the window and pressed his back against the wall, suddenly aware of how vulnerable he was. His rifle hung above the fireplace, but he hadn't cleaned it in months. His hands had grown soft from lack of work. If trouble was coming, he wasn't ready for it. The sound of wheels on gravel filled his ears as the convoy drew closer. Through a crack in his curtains, he caught glimpses of reinforced stagecoaches with iron plating on their sides. Armed riders flanked the wagons, their faces hard and alert. This wasn't a merchant caravan or a military patrol. This was something else entirely. The lead coach stopped directly in front of his cabin, close enough that he could see the brass fittings on the harness. Steam rose from the horses' flanks, evidence of hard travel over rough terrain. A woman stepped down from the driver's seat, brushing dust from her dark blue traveling dress. Even from his hiding spot, Ezra could see she was different from most frontier women. She moved with confidence, like someone used to being in charge. Her auburn hair was pinned up under a practical hat, and she wore boots instead of delicate shoes. This was a woman who knew how to take care of herself. She looked directly at his cabin, as if she could see him through the walls. "Mr. Blackwood," she called out, her voice carrying easily across the yard. "My name is Margaret Calloway. I believe you received my letter." Margaret Calloway stood in the dusty yard like she owned it, hands on her hips, studying Ezra's cabin with the sharp eyes of someone who missed nothing. Behind her, 11 more stagecoaches rolled to a stop in a line that stretched halfway down the hill. Each coach was built like a fortress, with thick wooden sides reinforced by iron bands and small windows covered with metal grates. The horses pulling them were big draft animals, bred for strength rather than speed. These wagons were meant to carry something heavy and valuable. Gold. The word whispered through Ezra's mind, like a dangerous secret. "I know you're in there, Mr. Blackwood," Margaret called again, this time with a hint of amusement in her voice. "I can see your shadow in the window. We've traveled 800 miles to find you, so the least you can do is come outside and say hello." Ezra's throat worked uselessly, trying to form words that wouldn't come. He hadn't spoken to another human being in 6 months. The last visitor had been the circuit preacher, who'd given up trying to save Ezra's soul after an hour of one-sided conversation. Through his window, he watched Margaret's crew unhitch their horses with practiced efficiency. These weren't ordinary travelers. They moved like soldiers, checking their weapons and scanning the horizon for threats. 2 men carried rifles that gleamed with fresh oil. A third kept his hand near the pistol on his hip. What kind of cargo required this much protection? Margaret walked closer to his door, her boots crunching on the gravel. "Mr. Blackwood, I understand you've been through difficult times. What happened at Prospector's Gulch was a tragedy, but it wasn't your fault. The territorial investigation made that clear." "The investigation?" Ezra remembered sitting in that stuffy courthouse in Helena, facing a panel of men in expensive suits who'd never set foot in a mine. They'd asked him hundreds of questions about safety procedures and timber specifications and gas detection methods. He'd answered everyone, his voice growing smaller with each word until it finally disappeared altogether. The official verdict had been accidental cave-in due to unstable geological conditions. In other words, nobody's fault. An act of God. These things happened in mining country. But official verdicts didn't bring back 17 dead men. I have something that belongs to those families, Margaret continued, her voice softer now. Something that might help ease their suffering. But I need your help to get it to them safely. A young man approached Margaret from the convoy, his face flushed with excitement. Ma'am, should we start unloading the— James? Margaret cut him off sharply. Remember what we discussed about discretion. The young man nodded quickly and retreated to tend the horses. But his slip had revealed something important. They were planning to unload whatever they carried. Here, at Ezra's cabin. Margaret tried the door handle and found it unlocked. Frontier hospitality died hard, even in ghost towns. She pushed the door open slowly, like someone entering a church. Mr. Blackwood, I'm coming in. Please, don't be frightened. Ezra backed away from the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. The cabin suddenly seemed too small, too exposed. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. He grabbed his slate board from its hook by the fireplace, his only way to communicate since losing his voice. Margaret stepped inside and stopped, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. She saw the cold coffee, the unmade bed, the calendar frozen in 1864. Her expression softened with something that might have been pity or understanding. Oh, Mr. Blackwood, she said quietly. You've been punishing yourself all this time, haven't you? Ezra turned to face her, and Margaret's breath caught when she saw the scar across his throat. It was worse than she'd imagined. A twisted line of damaged flesh that spoke of terrible pain and permanent loss. He held up the slate board and wrote in shaky letters, "What do you want?" Margaret pulled a chair away from his table and sat down uninvited, making herself at home in his private space. I want to help you find your way back to the world of the living. Ezra wrote, Too late for that. Is it? Margaret reached into her traveling bag and pulled out a thick folder stuffed with official documents. Tell me, Mr. Blackwood, what do you know about the Denver Mining Consortium? The name hit Ezra like a punch to the stomach. He'd heard whispers about the consortium back in his working days, a group of wealthy investors who bought up mining claims throughout the territory. They paid top dollar but cut corners on safety to maximize profits. Smart miners avoided working for them. Margaret opened the folder and spread papers across his table. For the past 2 years, I've been investigating mining accidents across the territory. Do you know what I found? Ezra shook his head. 43 separate incidents. Hundreds of dead miners. All at mines owned or operated by the consortium. Margaret's voice hardened with anger. They knew their safety procedures were inadequate. They knew men would die. They simply didn't care because dead miners can't demand better working conditions. She pulled out a specific document, a contract bearing familiar signatures, including the lease agreement for Prospector's Gulch. Your mine wasn't owned by the local mining company like everyone thought. It was owned by the consortium, operated under a false name to hide their involvement. The slateboard slipped from Ezra's nerveless fingers and clattered to the floor. The timber supports that failed? They were installed by consortium contractors using substandard materials. The ventilation system that should have warned you about gas buildup? It was deliberately disabled to save money on maintenance. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes blazing with righteous fury. Those 17 men didn't die because of unstable geology, Mr. Blackwood. They died because rich men in Denver decided their lives weren't worth the cost of proper safety equipment. Ezra sank into his remaining chair, his legs suddenly too weak to hold him. Everything he'd believed about the accident, everything he'd blamed himself for, was a lie. The guilt that had eaten away at him for 3 years was based on incomplete information. But that didn't bring back the dead. Margaret seemed to read his thoughts. You're right. Nothing can bring them back. But we can make sure their families receive compensation for what was stolen from them. She gestured toward the convoy waiting outside. 12 stagecoaches, Mr. Blackwood, each one carrying refined gold worth more than most people see in a lifetime. Payments seized from consortium bank accounts by federal marshals acting on my investigation. Ezra picked up his slate and wrote, "How much?" "Enough to buy land, build houses, send children to school. Enough to give 17 families a chance at the life they should have had." Margaret stood and walked to his window, looking out at the waiting coaches. "But there's a problem." Of course there was. There was always a problem. The consortium knows what we're doing. They have hired guns tracking our movement, trying to steal back what we've taken from them. We've already fought off 2 attacks on the road from Denver. She turned back to face him. "I need someone who knows these mountains. Someone who can guide us safely to Helena where the gold can be distributed to the families." Ezra wrote, "Find someone else." "There is no one else." Margaret's voice carried absolute conviction. "Every other guide in the territory is either dead, bought off, or too scared to cross the consortium. You're the only one with both the knowledge we need and the integrity to see this through." She paused, studying his scarred face with surprising gentleness. "Besides, you're the only one who truly understands what those families have lost. You carry their grief every day. Who better to carry their compensation?" Outside, voices called back and forth as Margaret's crew set up a temporary camp in Ezra's yard. Someone was building a cooking fire. Someone else was checking the wheels on the lead coach. They were settling in like they planned to stay. Margaret sat back down across from him. "I know you blame yourself for what happened. I know the guilt has been eating you alive. But guilt without action is just self-pity, Mr. Blackwood. This is your chance to turn that guilt into something useful." Ezra stared at the papers scattered across his table. Names of dead miners. Reports of safety violations. Bank records showing enormous profits built on the graves of working men. The evidence painted a picture of systematic murder disguised as business operations. He picked up his chalk and wrote slowly, "Why should I trust you?" Margaret smiled for the first time since entering his cabin. "Because I'm the only person in the territory who's more angry about this than you are. Because I've spent 2 years of my life building this case, when I could have been home in San Francisco living comfortably off my late husband's estate. Because those 17 men deserve justice, and their families deserve hope." She leaned back in her chair, suddenly looking tired. "And because you need this as much as they do. You've been dead for 3 years, Mr. Blackwood. This is your chance to start living again." Through his window, Ezra could see the sun climbing toward its noon position. In a few hours, it would be exactly 3 years since the cave-in. 3 years since he'd sent 17 men to their deaths. 3 years since his world had collapsed along with that mine shaft. Maybe Margaret was right. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. But could a man who'd lost his voice find the courage to speak for the dead? The gold gleamed like captured sunlight in Margaret's palm, each nugget heavy with the weight of broken promises and stolen lives. She'd opened one of the iron strongboxes to show Ezra what they were really carrying, and now the afternoon light streaming through his cabin window made the precious metal glow like fire. Raw gold, refined gold, gold coins bearing the faces of presidents, enough wealth to buy a small city or corrupt an entire territory. "This is just one box," Margaret said, letting the nuggets spill through her fingers back into their velvet-lined container. "Each coach carries 12 boxes exactly like this one." Ezra's chalk scratched across his slate. "That's more gold than I've seen in my whole life. It's more gold than most people see in 10 lifetimes." Margaret closed the strongbox with a solid click. The consortium pulled this from mines across 3 territories over the past 5 years. Every ounce was bought with blood. Outside, her crew had transformed his dead yard into a bustling camp. Cook fires sent smoke spiraling into the clear mountain air. Men checked weapons and harnessed leather with the careful attention of people who knew their lives depended on being ready for trouble. The horses grazed on wild grass, but even they seemed nervous, ears constantly swiveling at every sound. James Morrison, Margaret's second-in-command, appeared in the doorway. He was younger than Ezra had first thought, maybe 25, with a kind of smooth face that suggested he'd never seen real hardship. His clean clothes and soft hands marked him as someone more comfortable with ledgers than rifles. "Ma'am, we've got a problem," James said, his voice tight with worry. "Billy spotted riders on the eastern ridge. Could be scouts." Margaret's expression hardened instantly. "How many?" 3, maybe 4. They disappeared behind the rocks before Billy could get a good count. Ezra grabbed his slate. Consortium men? Most likely, Margaret replied grimly. They've been following us since Denver, always staying just out of rifle range, like wolves tracking wounded prey. She stood and moved to the window, studying the distant ridgeline with eyes that had learned to spot danger. How well do you know the country between here and Helena, Mr. Blackwood? Ezra's throat worked silently as he considered the question. Helena lay 60 miles northeast through some of the roughest terrain in Montana Territory. The main road wound through 3 mountain passes, crossed 2 major rivers, and passed through Deadwood Canyon, a perfect spot for an ambush. A dozen gold-laden coaches would crawl along that route like sitting ducks. He wrote, "Main road is suicide. Too many places for ambush." Then what do you suggest? Ezra hesitated, his chalk hovering over the slate. What he was thinking was dangerous, maybe impossible, but it might be their only chance. There's another way, he wrote slowly. Harder route through old mining country. Abandoned settlements, forgotten trails. Longer, but safer. Margaret leaned over his shoulder to read, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used, despite days of hard travel. How much longer? 4 days instead of 2. Rough country. Coaches might not make it. They'll make it, James interrupted from the doorway. We reinforced every wheel and axle before leaving Denver. These coaches could roll through hell itself. Margaret studied Ezra's scarred face with calculating eyes. This alternate route, you've traveled it before? Ezra nodded, then wrote, used to prospect that country before Prospector's Gulch. Know every canyon and creek. What he didn't write was why he knew that country so well. In his younger days, before responsibility and guilt had bent his shoulders, he'd spent months searching for the legendary Lost Dutchman mine. Like hundreds of other dreamers, he'd followed rumors and half-remembered stories through valleys that seemed to exist only in shadow and mist. He'd never found the Lost Dutchman, but he'd found something else, a network of natural caves and abandoned mine shafts that honeycombed the mountains like an underground highway, places where a small group could disappear completely, traveling unseen beneath the very noses of their enemies. Margaret must have seen something in his expression, because she asked, "What aren't you telling me, Mr. Blackwood?" Ezra's chalk moved reluctantly across the slate. Some of the route goes underground, through old mines and natural caves, dark places. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone in the room understood what he wasn't saying. Underground passages meant tunnels. Tunnels meant the possibility of cave-ins. And cave-ins meant the kind of death that had already claimed 17 men under his watch. How dangerous? Margaret asked quietly. Dangerous enough, Ezra wrote, but safer than trying to fight the consortium in open country. James shifted nervously in the doorway. Ma'am, maybe we should stick to the main road. We've got enough firepower to handle a few hired guns. A few? Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in it. James, the consortium has enough money to hire an army. We've been lucky so far, but luck runs out. She turned back to Ezra. If we take your route, what are our chances of reaching Helena alive? Ezra considered the question seriously. The underground passages were treacherous but predictable. Rockfalls followed natural patterns. Gas pockets could be detected if you knew what to look for. The real danger would come from the darkness itself, the way it played tricks on your mind, made you hear voices in the stone, made you question every shadow. He wrote, better than 50. 50. Maybe 60% if we're careful. And if we take the main road, Ezra's chalk scraped hard against the slate. 20%. Maybe less. Margaret walked to his fireplace and stared at the cold ashes in the grate. Her shoulders were straight, but Ezra could see the weight of command bearing down on her. 23 lives rode on her decision, her crew, herself, and the families waiting for justice in Helena. There's something else you should know, she said without turning around. About why I'm really here. James made a small sound of protest, but Margaret silenced him with a raised hand. The truth is, Mr. Blackwood, this gold represents more than just compensation for mining accidents. It's evidence, proof of the consortium's crimes going back a decade. She faced him again, her green eyes blazing with purpose. If we can get it to Helena, we can destroy them completely. Not just their Montana operations, all of it. Every corrupt mine, every bought judge, every murdered miner. Ezra wrote, and if we don't, then they win. They keep killing miners for profit. And 17 more families join the ranks of the forgotten dead. Margaret's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Including us. Because if the consortium catches us, we won't live to see another sunrise. The weight of her words settled over the room like a physical presence. This wasn't just about delivering gold to grieving families. This was about bringing down an empire built on the bones of working men. The stakes couldn't be higher. A shout from outside interrupted the heavy silence. "Riders coming in fast!" Margaret and James rushed to the window while Ezra grabbed his rifle from above the fireplace. His hands remembered the familiar weight of the weapon, even though he hadn't fired it in months. Through the glass, he could see dust clouds approaching from the south, not the careful movements of scouts, but the desperate charge of men fleeing pursuit. "It's Billy," James said, relief evident in his voice. "And he's bringing company." Billy Hutchins was Margaret's best scout, a grizzled mountain man who could track a whisper through solid rock. His horse was lathered with sweat and foam, pushed to its limits by hard riding. Behind him rode 2 other men. Ezra didn't recognize strangers with the hollow-eyed look of people who'd seen too much death. Billy slid from his saddle before his horse had fully stopped. "Ma'am, we got big trouble coming. Saw a war party of at least 30 men making camp 5 miles south. They're armed for bear and asking questions about gold." "Consortium?" Margaret asked. "Some of them. But there's others too, bounty hunters, claim jumpers, every piece of human trash between here and Denver. Word's gotten out about what we're carrying." The 2 strangers dismounted more slowly, their movements careful and pained. One had a bandage wrapped around his left arm, dark with dried blood. The other limped badly, favoring his right leg. "Who are your friends, Billy?" Margaret asked. "Ma'am, meet Frank Weber and Dutch Cassidy. They were running mail between Helena and Butte when the war party caught them, barely escaped with their lives." Frank Weber stepped forward, removing his hat respectfully. He was a big man, with shoulders like an ox, but his face was drawn with exhaustion and pain. "Miss Calloway, I presume?" "Frank Weber, Territorial Mail Service. Dutch and I heard about your mission from the postmaster in Helena. We came looking for you." "Why?" Dutch Cassidy answered, his voice rough with fatigue. "Because there's something you need to know about Helena. Something that changes everything." Margaret's face went pale. "What do you mean?" "The territorial governor's been bought," Frank said bluntly. "Consortium gold, delivered 3 days ago. Soon as you ride into Helena, you'll be arrested on charges of theft and murder." The words hit the group like a physical blow. Ezra saw the hope drain from Margaret's face, replaced by the bitter understanding that their enemies had anticipated every move. "How do you know this?" she asked. "Because the governor's adjutant is my brother-in-law," Dutch replied. "He sent us to warn you. Said to tell you that Helena's a trap and you need to find another way." Margaret sank into a chair, her composure finally cracking. "Another way to do what? If we can't deliver the gold to the territorial authorities, then this whole mission was pointless." Ezra picked up his chalk and wrote quickly. "Not pointless. Different." "What do you mean?" He erased the slate and wrote again. "Don't deliver to authorities. Deliver directly to families." Margaret stared at the words, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You mean bypass the government entirely? Just show up at their doors with bags of gold?" Ezra nodded. It was dangerous, maybe impossible, but it was also the only way to ensure the gold reached the people who truly deserved it. "That would mean finding 17 families scattered across 3 territories," James protested. "It could take months." "Then it takes months," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "We didn't come this far to give up because of corrupt politicians." She stood and walked to the door, looking out at her crew preparing for another night on the trail. "Gentlemen, it appears we have a new mission. Instead of delivering evidence to the government, we're going to deliver justice directly to the people." Frank Weber grinned despite his exhaustion. "Ma'am, if you're serious about this, Dutch and I would be honored to ride with you. We know where most of those families are living. And I know how to get there without being caught," Ezra wrote on his slate. Margaret read his words and smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since she arrived. "Mr. Blackwood, are you saying you'll guide us?" Ezra looked around the room at the faces watching him expectantly. These people were offering him something he'd thought was lost forever, a chance to matter again. A chance to honor the dead by helping the living. He erased his slate one more time, and wrote in large, clear letters, "When do we leave?" Dawn broke over the mountains like a gunshot, sharp and sudden, catching Ezra in the middle of the hardest decision of his life. He stood outside his cabin, watching Margaret's crew load the gold coaches with supplies for what could be a month-long journey through some of the most dangerous country in the American West. Each man worked with quiet efficiency, checking weapons, securing cargo, preparing for a mission that would either make them heroes or get them all killed. "Having second thoughts?" Margaret asked, appearing beside him with 2 cups of coffee that actually steamed in the morning air. Ezra accepted the cup gratefully and wrote on his slate, "Third and fourth thoughts." "That's normal. Fear keeps people alive in country like this." Margaret sipped her coffee and studied the eastern horizon where pink light was beginning to paint the peaks. "But so does purpose. And you have more purpose than anyone else in this convoy." She was right, though Ezra wasn't sure that made him feel better. The weight of responsibility sat on his shoulders like a physical burden heavier than the gold they carried, heavier than the guilt he'd carried for 3 years. 24 lives now depended on his knowledge of trails that existed mostly in memory and maps drawn on scraps of paper years ago. Billy Hutchins approached them, his weathered face grim with concern. "Ma'am, I've been thinking about our route. If we're really planning to visit 17 families scattered across 3 territories, we're talking about covering maybe 1,000 miles through country that's crawling with hostile forces." "Hostile forces?" Ezra wrote. "Consortium gunmen, sure. But that's not the half of it," Billy continued. "There's Crow war parties moving through the northern passes, claim jumpers working the streams east of here, and at least 3 separate gangs of road agents operating between here and the Canadian border." Margaret's expression didn't change, but Ezra saw her knuckles whiten around her coffee cup. "What's your recommendation, Billy?" "Split up. Divide the gold among smaller groups, each taking a different route to a different set of families. Harder to track 12 separate parties than one big convoy." James Morrison overheard and joined their conversation, shaking his head vigorously. "That's suicide. We barely have enough firepower to protect one convoy, let alone 12. Split up and we'll be picked off one by one." "Maybe," Billy acknowledged, "but staying together makes us a bigger target. Word's spreading fast about what we're carrying. Every cutthroat and desperado between here and Mexico is going to be gunning for us." Ezra listened to the debate while studying the faces of Margaret's crew. They were good men, most of them, but they weren't soldiers. James was an accountant who'd learned to shoot out of necessity. Billy was a scout, comfortable alone in the wilderness but unused to leading armed groups. The others were drivers, cooks, and mechanics essential for keeping the convoy moving, but not trained for the kind of warfare they might face. He wrote on his slate, "What if we do both?" Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Explain." "Keep some coaches together as decoy. Send others on secret routes." Ezra paused to organize his thoughts, then continued writing. "Consortium expects big convoy on main roads. Give them what they expect while real gold goes different way." Billy's eyes lit up with understanding. "A shell game. Brilliant. It could work," Margaret mused. "But who leads the decoy convoy, and who takes the real gold?" Before anyone could answer, Dutch Cassidy limped over from the campfire where he'd been sharing breakfast with Frank Weber. Both men looked better after a night's rest, though Dutch still favored his injured leg. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but Frank and I might have a solution to your problem." Dutch gestured toward his partner. "Frank here used to be a cavalry sergeant before he started carrying mail. He knows tactics." Frank Weber stepped forward, his massive frame casting a long shadow in the morning light. "Ma'am, if you're serious about this decoy idea, I volunteer to lead the fake convoy. Dutch and I can take 6 empty coaches north toward Helena, making enough noise to draw attention from every hostile within 50 miles. "That's a suicide mission," James protested. "Maybe, but it's our choice to make." Frank's voice carried the quiet authority of a man who'd faced death before and made peace with it. "Dutch and I both lost friends in consortium mines. This is our chance to balance the scales." Margaret studied the 2 mail carriers with new respect. "What would you need?" 6 volunteers to drive empty coaches, enough supplies for a week on the trail, and weapons, lots of weapons. Frank grinned, transforming his weathered face. "If we're going to put on a show, might as well make it memorable." Ezra wrote quickly, "What about real gold? How many coaches?" 6 should be enough," Margaret calculated. We can redistribute the gold into fewer containers, make each coach carry double loads. That means fewer people to guard it, Billy pointed out, but also fewer people to feed, fewer horses to manage, less chance of someone making a mistake that gives us away, Margaret countered. Quality over quantity. As they talked, Ezra found himself studying the faces around him with new eyes. These people were volunteering to risk everything for families they'd never met, for a cause that offered them nothing but danger and hardship. It was the kind of nobility he'd stopped believing in after the mine collapse. There's something else to consider, Dutch said quietly. The families we're trying to help, they're scattered from here to the Dakota border. Some are living in towns where the consortium has influence. Others are hiding in places so remote, they might not trust strangers carrying gold. Margaret frowned. What do you mean? I mean, some of these widows have been threatened, told to keep quiet about how their husbands died. They might think you're consortium agents trying to trick them. Dutch's expression was grim. Gold can be a curse as well as a blessing, especially to people who've learned not to trust good fortune. The observation sent a chill through the group. In their focus on reaching the families, they'd forgotten to consider how those families might react to unexpected visitors bearing impossible gifts. 17 women who'd lost everything might be suspicious of anyone offering to restore their fortunes. Then we'll need more than gold, Margaret said slowly. We'll need proof, documentation, something that shows who we are and why we're there. James reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a leather portfolio. Ma'am, I have copies of all the legal documents from Denver. Court orders, banking records, death certificates, everything needed to prove the consortium's guilt and the family's right to compensation. That's a start. But we need something more personal. Something that shows we really knew their husbands. Ezra's chalk moved across his slate. I knew them. Margaret turned to him, sudden understanding dawning in her eyes. Of course. You were their foreman. You would have known each man personally, their families, their dreams, their habits. Ezra nodded, though the memories hurt like reopened wounds. Samuel Torres always carried a picture of his 3 children in his lunch pail. Benjamin Walsh had been saving money to buy his new wife a piano. Patrick O'Brien spoke constantly about bringing his elderly mother from Ireland to live with him in America. If you came with us to meet the families, Margaret said carefully, they would trust you. They would know we're legitimate. The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Ezra had spent 3 years hiding from the world, avoiding the families of the men who'd died under his supervision. The thought of facing them directly, of looking into the eyes of their widows and children, terrified him more than any physical danger. But it was also the only way to ensure the gold reached the right hands. He wrote, They blame me for what happened. Some might, Margaret agreed, but others will see you as someone who shared their loss, someone who understands their pain. Billy cleared his throat. Ma'am, if we're going to do this, we need to move soon. Every hour we delay gives the consortium more time to organize pursuit. Margaret looked around the circle of faces, seeing determination mixed with fear in every expression. All right then, here's how we'll do it. Frank and Dutch take 6 empty coaches north toward Helena, making as much noise as possible. The rest of us take the real gold on a southern route, visiting families in order of proximity. What about supplies? James asked. Food, ammunition, spare parts for the coaches? We travel light and live off the land where possible. Buy supplies in small towns. Avoid large settlements where consortium agents might be watching. Margaret's voice carried the authority of command, but Ezra could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She was making up strategy as she went along, hoping experience would substitute for detailed planning. Ma'am, Frank said respectfully, there's one more thing to consider. If Dutch and I are successful in drawing pursuit, we might not survive the encounter. You should be prepared for that possibility. The stark honesty of his statement silenced the group. They were talking about real sacrifice now, not just adventure or heroism. Men might die in the next few days, and everyone present understood the stakes. Margaret extended her hand to Frank, who shook it with solemn dignity. Mr. Weber, if you and Dutch are willing to take this risk, I can only say that history will remember your courage. History can go hang itself, Frank replied with a grin. We're not doing this for history. We're doing it because it's right. As the sun climbed higher, the 2 groups began their preparations. Frank and Dutch selected 6 volunteers from Margaret's crewmen who understood they might be riding to their deaths but believed the cause was worth the sacrifice. They loaded their coaches with supplies and empty strongboxes, designed to look convincing from a distance. Meanwhile, Margaret's remaining crew redistributed the real gold into 6 heavily laden coaches. The precious metal made each vehicle significantly heavier, requiring stronger horses and more careful driving. But it also meant fewer people would know the exact location of the treasure at any given time. Ezra found himself checking and rechecking his old survey maps, trying to remember details of trails he hadn't traveled in years. The route he'd planned would take them through abandoned mining camps, across high mountain passes, and along river valleys where few people ventured. It would be dangerous, exhausting, and uncertain. But it might work. As both groups prepared to depart, Margaret pulled Ezra aside for a private conversation. "Mr. Blackwood, I want you to know that whatever happens in the coming days, you've already done more than anyone had the right to ask." Ezra wrote, "Haven't done anything yet. You've given us hope. You've shown us a way forward when we thought we were trapped." Margaret's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "That matters more than you know." In the distance, Frank Weber called out final instructions to his volunteers. Dutch Cassidy checked his weapons one last time. The decoy convoy was almost ready to begin its dangerous masquerade. Margaret's group finished their own preparations, securing the real gold under canvas covers and distributing ammunition to everyone who could handle a weapon. Even Ezra strapped on a pistol, though he hoped he wouldn't need to use it. As both convoys prepared to separate and begin their respective journeys, Ezra felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in 3 years' purpose. These people were depending on him not just to guide them through dangerous country, but to help them complete a mission that could bring justice to 17 families and closure to his own tormented soul. The question that remained was whether a man who'd lost his voice could find the courage to speak for the dead when it mattered most. Gunfire erupted from the canyon ahead like thunder rolling between stone walls, and Margaret knew their careful plans were falling apart. She pulled her horse to a sudden stop, raising her fist to signal the convoy behind her. 6 gold-laden coaches stretched along the narrow mountain trail, their iron-reinforced wheels grinding against loose rock and ancient pine roots. The sound of battle echoed off the towering cliffs, rifle shots, shouting voices, the terrified screaming of horses. "That's coming from Devil's Backbone Pass," Billy whispered, his weathered face pale with worry. "Right where Frank and Dutch should be leading their decoy convoy." Ezra rode up beside them, his damaged throat working silently as he listened to the distant gunfight. On his slate, he scrawled quickly, "Too many shots. Big fight." Margaret's stomach twisted into knots. Frank Weber and Dutch Cassidy had volunteered to draw the consortium's attention away from the real gold, but the intensity of the battle suggested they'd run into more than just a few hired guns. This sounded like a small war. "Ma'am, we need to keep moving," James Morrison urged from the driver's seat of the lead coach. "Whatever's happening up there, we can't help them now." The cold logic of his words burned like acid in Margaret's throat. Frank and Dutch were fighting for their lives while she sat here listening to their desperate battle. But James was right, stopping to help would only get more people killed and put the gold at risk. Another volley of shots rang out, closer this time. Then silence. "Jesus," Billy breathed. "I think it's over." The sudden quiet was worse than the gunfire. It meant decisions had been made, lives had been lost, and the morning would bring buzzards to pick clean whatever remained. Margaret closed her eyes and said a silent prayer for 2 brave men who'd chosen sacrifice over safety. "Which way now, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. Ezra consulted his hand-drawn map, comparing it to the landscape around them. The original plan had called for taking the Southern Ridge Trail toward the first family on their list, Samuel Torres's widow, Maria, who lived with her 3 children in a cabin near Copper Creek. But with the consortium forces engaged in Devil's Backbone Pass, maybe they could risk a more direct route. He wrote, "Can try Middle Trail. Faster, but more exposed." How much faster? Half day saved. But if spotted, nowhere to hide. Margaret studied the terrain ahead. The Middle Trail cut across open meadowland before disappearing into a forest of towering pines. Beautiful country, but dangerous for people trying to avoid detection. A single lookout with field glasses could spot their convoy from miles away. "What do you think, Billy?" she asked her scout. Billy chewed his tobacco thoughtfully, his eyes scanning the distant ridgelines for signs of movement. "I don't like it, ma'am. Too much open ground. But if Frank and Dutch really did draw off the main pursuit force," he shrugged, "might be our best chance." A new sound drifted across the morning air, the rhythmic pounding of many horses moving fast. Margaret strained her ears, trying to determine direction and distance. The sound seemed to be coming from the north, maybe 2 miles away. "Company," Billy said grimly. Ezra grabbed his field glasses and focused on a dust cloud rising from the valley below. After a moment, he lowered the glasses and wrote urgently, 20 riders, moving this way, maybe 30 minutes. Margaret's mind raced through their options. They could turn back, but that would only delay the inevitable confrontation. They could try to outrun pursuit, but the gold-heavy coaches couldn't match the speed of mounted riders. Or they could make a stand here in the rocks, but 6 coaches were hard to defend against determined attackers. "There's another option," she said slowly. "Something risky, but it might work." She dismounted and walked to the back of the lead coach, where a canvas-covered strongbox sat secured with iron chains. Inside was enough refined gold to buy a small army or bribe a large one. "What are you thinking, ma'am?" James asked nervously. "I'm thinking that not every man can be bought, but most men have a price." Margaret hefted a leather pouch heavy with gold coins. "And sometimes the best way to win a fight is to avoid having one." Billy's eyes widened with understanding. "You want to buy them off?" "I want to find out what they really want. Money? Revenge? A chance to get rich quick?" Margaret climbed back onto her horse, the gold pouch secured to her saddle. "Ezra, is there a good place for a parley somewhere ahead?" Ezra nodded and pointed toward a grove of aspen trees, where the trail widened into a natural clearing. It was defensible, but not threatening, the kind of place where reasonable men might sit down and discuss business. "All right then, Billy. I want you to ride ahead and find a good observation post. If this goes wrong, you get word to the families about what we tried to do." Margaret checked her pistol, making sure it was loaded but not obviously threatening. "James, you and the others stay with the coaches. Keep the gold covered and the weapons handy. But don't do anything aggressive unless shooting starts." "Ma'am, this is madness," James protested. "You can't trust road agents and cutthroats." "I'm not trusting them. I'm negotiating with them." Margaret's voice carried more confidence than she felt. "Sometimes that's the difference between living and dying." She rode toward the aspen grove with Ezra beside her, acutely aware that the next few minutes would determine whether their mission succeeded or ended in blood and failure. Behind them, the coaches creaked forward slowly, their precious cargo hidden beneath innocent-looking canvas covers. The sound of approaching horses grew louder. Margaret could make out individual voices now, men calling back and forth, discussing strategy and positioning. They weren't just random bandits looking for easy prey. This was an organized force with military discipline. "Ma'am," Ezra wrote on his slate, "what if they won't negotiate?" Margaret considered the question as they reached the clearing. Around them, aspens whispered in the morning breeze, their leaves already showing hints of the gold they'd wear in autumn. It was a peaceful place, beautiful in its mountain simplicity. A good place to die, if it came to that. "Then we fight," she said simply, "and hope we take enough of them with us to make the survivors think twice about pursuing the others." The first riders appeared at the far end of the clearing, hard-faced men, with the lean look of professional fighters. They rode in formation, weapons ready but not aimed, like cavalry scouts approaching a potentially hostile position. Their leader was a tall man with graying hair and the kind of scars that spoke of many battles survived. Margaret raised her hand in the universal gesture of parley, palm open and empty of weapons. The leader responded with a similar gesture, though his men kept their rifles across their saddles. "Morning, ma'am," the leader called as he rode closer. "Name's Captain Joshua Brennan, late of the Union Army. I believe you're the lady carrying a considerable amount of gold through my territory." "Your territory?" Margaret kept her voice level, neither challenging nor submissive. "Everything between the Canadian border and the Yellowstone River, ma'am. At least, everything that isn't already claimed by people tougher than me." Brennan's smile held no warmth. "Which brings me to my business with you." He gestured toward his men, and Margaret counted at least 15 rifles pointed in her general direction. Not directly threatening, but the message was clear. "I'm listening, Captain." she said. The way I see it, you've got three choices. First, you can turn around and go back where you came from. Second, you can pay a reasonable toll for safe passage through my territory. Third, he shrugged eloquently. What's reasonable? Half. The word hit Margaret like a physical blow. Half the gold meant half the compensation for 17 families. It meant children who wouldn't go to school, widows who wouldn't be able to buy land, futures stolen by the greed of men who'd never worked an honest day in their lives. That's quite a toll, Captain. Well, ma'am, it's quite a lot of gold, and quite a dangerous stretch of country between here and wherever you're headed. Brennan's expression remained pleasant, but his eyes were cold as winter stones. Of course, I could be persuaded to negotiate, depending on what you're really carrying and where you're really going. Margaret felt Ezra tense beside her. This was the moment of truth. Tell the truth and hope Brennan had some spark of decency left. Or lie and hope he couldn't see through their deception. Captain, have you ever lost someone you loved to another man's greed? The question seemed to catch Brennan off guard. His pleasant mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something raw and painful underneath. Ma'am, I've lost more than you want to know. Then maybe you'll understand why I can't give you half this gold. Margaret's voice grew stronger, more passionate. It belongs to 17 families whose husbands and fathers died in unsafe mines. Widows and children who've lost everything because rich men in Denver decided their lives weren't worth the cost of proper safety equipment. She pulled out the leather pouch and let it fall open, spilling gold coins onto the ground between them. The metal caught the sunlight like captured fire. This isn't stolen treasure, Captain. It's compensation seized from the mining consortium that murdered those men. And every coin I give you is food taken from the mouths of orphaned children. Brennan stared at the scattered gold, his expression unreadable. Behind him, his men shifted restlessly in their saddles, clearly wondering why their leader wasn't simply taking what he wanted. 17 families, he said quietly. 17 families, Margaret confirmed. Some with children so young they'll never remember their fathers' faces. For a long moment, the only sound in the clearing was the whisper of aspen leaves and the creak of leather saddles. Margaret held her breath, knowing that everything depended on whether Joshua Brennan still had enough humanity left to care about the suffering of strangers. Finally, he dismounted and walked to where the gold coins lay scattered in the dirt. With careful deliberation, he picked up each coin and dropped it back into Margaret's pouch. Ma'am, I believe you've got yourself safe passage through my territory, he said, handing her the restored pouch. On one condition, which is, when you deliver that gold to those families, you tell them it came from Captain Joshua Brennan and his men. Tell them we said their husbands died with honor, and their sacrifice won't be forgotten. Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. Captain, I don't understand. Brennan's scarred face softened with something that might have been remembered pain. Ma'am, I lost my own boys in the war. Both of them, fighting for causes they barely understood. If someone had tried to help my wife after they died, he shrugged, unable to finish the sentence. He remounted his horse and signaled to his men. You'll have safe passage as far as Copper Creek. After that, you're on your own. As Brennan and his riders disappeared back into the forest, Margaret sat in her saddle feeling as if the world had shifted beneath her feet. She'd expected violence, prepared for death, and instead found unexpected mercy from the most unlikely source. Ezra wrote on his slate, "Good men in strange places." Yes, Margaret whispered, watching the dust settle where the riders had vanished. Thank God for that. Maria Torres opened her cabin door with a shotgun in her hands and 3 small faces peering out from behind her skirts, and Ezra's heart broke all over again. She looked exactly as he remembered from the company picnics 3 years ago. Dark hair streaked with premature gray-brown eyes that had once sparkled with laughter, now shadowed with worry and loss. But the shotgun was new, as was the defensive way she held herself, ready to fight for her children against whatever fresh disaster the world might bring to her door. Mrs. Torres, Margaret said carefully, keeping her hands visible and empty. My name is Margaret Calloway. This is Ezra Blackwood. We've come about your husband Samuel. Maria's grip tightened on the shotgun. I know who he is. He's the man who sent my Samuel into that death trap. Her voice carried 3 years of accumulated bitterness. What do you want? Behind Margaret, the convoy had stopped a respectful distance from the small cabin, but Ezra could see armed men watching from the coach windows. This wasn't how he'd imagined their first meeting with a miner's family would go. Ezra dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He pulled out his slate and wrote, "Mrs. Torres, I'm sorry. Sorry for your loss. Sorry I failed to keep Samuel safe." Maria read the words, and something in her expression shifted slightly. "Why can't you speak?" He touched his throat, showing her the scar. "Mine accident. Same one that killed Samuel." "You were hurt too?" Ezra nodded, then wrote, "Should have been me instead." The words seemed to hit Maria like a physical blow. The shotgun wavered in her hands as she studied Ezra's face, seeing the guilt and pain etched in every line. "Mama," a small voice whispered from behind her. "Who are these people?" Maria's youngest, little Rosa, couldn't have been more than 4 years old. She had her father's dark eyes and serious expression, but there was a fragility about her that spoke of too many nights going to bed hungry. "Rosa, take your brothers inside," Maria said gently. "Grown-ups need to talk." "But Mama," "Inside. Now." The children reluctantly disappeared into the cabin's dim interior, but Ezra could see their faces pressed against the single window, watching with the intense curiosity of young ones who'd learned that adult conversations often determine their fate. "Mrs. Torres," Margaret said, "we haven't come to make excuses or ask forgiveness. We've come to bring you something that belongs to your family." She gestured toward James Morrison, who approached carefully carrying a medium-sized leather satchel. Inside, Ezra knew, was enough gold to change the Torres family's life forever, if Maria would accept it. "Samuel Torres worked for 5 years in the mines," Margaret continued. "He died because the mining company used substandard safety equipment to save money. That was theft, Mrs. Torres. They stole your husband's life for profit." Maria's shotgun had lowered slightly, but her expression remained suspicious. "I know what killed my Samuel. I know who's to blame. Question is, what are you planning to do about it?" James opened the satchel, revealing neat stacks of gold coins that gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. "We're planning to give you this, ma'am. Compensation seized from the Denver Mining Consortium's bank accounts. Payment for what they stole from your family." Maria stared at the gold, her face cycling through disbelief, hope, and fear. "How much?" "Enough to buy land, build a proper house, send your children to school." Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. "Enough to give them the future Samuel wanted them to have." "This is some kind of trick," Maria said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Nobody gives away gold like that. Not to people like me." Ezra wrote on his slate, "Samuel always talked about his children. Said Rosa was going to be a teacher someday. Said the boys would own their own land, never have to work for other men." Maria's eyes filled with tears. "He did say that. Said it all the time." She looked at Ezra with new understanding. "You really knew him. Knew them all. Good men. Deserved better." From inside the cabin came the sound of children arguing over something normal childhood noise that seemed to break the tension of the adult conversation. Maria glanced toward the window where her sons were still watching, then back at the gold. "If I take this money, what happens next? Do I have to sign papers? Talk to lawyers? Pretend my Samuel died some other way?" "You take the money, and you use it to build a life for your children," Margaret said simply. "No strings attached. No conditions. It's yours, by right." Maria set the shotgun aside and approached the satchel cautiously, as if the gold might disappear if she moved too quickly. With trembling fingers, she picked up one of the coins and held it up to the light. "This is real," she whispered. "As real as your husband's sacrifice," Margaret confirmed. Suddenly Maria was crying, not the quiet tears she'd probably shed in private for 3 years, but deep, body-shaking sobs that seemed to come from the very center of her soul. Margaret moved to comfort her, but Maria waved her away. "I'm sorry," she gasped between sobs. "It's just, we've been so hungry. The boys are growing, and Rosa needs shoes, and the roof leaks when it rains, and I've been working my fingers raw taking in washing just to buy flour and beans." She looked up at Ezra with eyes that held years of accumulated desperation. "I blamed you. For 3 years, I blamed you for taking my Samuel away from us. But you lost him too, didn't you? You lost all of them." Ezra nodded, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. "I used to dream about what I'd say if I ever saw you again," Maria continued. "All the angry words, all the accusations. But looking at you now, she shook her head. You've been punishing yourself worse than I ever could. The cabin door opened, and the 3 children emerged cautiously. The oldest boy, Miguel, looked to be about 10, with his father's serious expression and his mother's determined chin. The middle child, Carlos, was maybe 7, all elbows and knees and nervous energy. Little Rosa hung back shyly, clutching a corn-husk doll that had seen better days. "Mama," Miguel asked, "are we in trouble?" "No, Mijo," Maria said, wiping her eyes and trying to compose herself. "These people came to help us. They brought us something that belonged to your papa." She showed them the gold coins, explaining in simple terms that the money would help them buy food and clothes and maybe even a bigger house. The children listened with the wide-eyed wonder of young ones who'd never seen such wealth. "Can we buy candy?" Carlos asked, his 7-year-old priorities immediately apparent. "We can buy lots of things," Maria laughed, her first genuine smile in years. "But first we need to thank these people for bringing Papa's money to us." Rosa stepped forward and tugged on Ezra's coat. When he knelt down to her level, she whispered, "Did you know my papa?" Ezra nodded and wrote on his slate, "Your papa was very brave. He talked about you all the time." "He did?" "Said you were going to be a teacher when you grow up." Rosa's face lit up with delight. "I am. I'm going to teach other little girls how to read and write and do numbers." The innocence and hope in her voice nearly broke Ezra's heart. This was why they'd traveled through dangerous country, risked their lives against impossible odds. For moments like this, when a child's dreams could be restored along with her family's future. Margaret cleared her throat gently. "Mrs. Torres, we have other families to visit. 16 more widows and their children who deserve the same chance you're getting." Maria nodded, understanding immediately. "Of course. You can't stay." She paused, looking at the gold with something approaching reverence. "How can I thank you for this?" "By using it well. By giving your children the life Samuel wanted them to have." As they prepared to leave, Maria caught Ezra's arm. "Mr. Blackwood, I want you to know something. Samuel never blamed you for what happened. In his last letter, he wrote about how you always put the miners' safety first. He trusted you completely." The words hit Ezra like a physical blow, releasing something that had been locked away in his chest for 3 years. For the first time since the cave-in, he felt a small crack appear in the wall of guilt he'd built around his heart. He wrote on his slate, "Thank you." As their convoy pulled away from the Torres cabin, Ezra looked back to see Maria and her children standing in their doorway, waving goodbye. The afternoon sun caught the gold coins in Maria's hands, making them shine like captured stars. "One down," Margaret said quietly. 16 to go. But Ezra was thinking about something else entirely. For the first time in 3 years, he'd looked into the eyes of a miner's widow and seen forgiveness instead of accusation. It was a small beginning, but perhaps it was enough. Perhaps redemption was possible after all, one family at a time. Behind them, smoke rose from the Torres cabin's chimney as Maria began cooking the first good meal her children had eaten in months. And somewhere in the distance, 16 other families waited for justice that was finally coming their way. The weight of gold had become the weight of hope, and Ezra Blackwood was learning to carry it without breaking. The abandoned church bell tolled 13 times in the wind, a sound that shouldn't exist because the church had burned down 2 years ago. Ezra jerked awake in his bedroll, heart pounding as the impossible sound echoed across the valley where they'd made camp for the night. Around him, Margaret's convoy slept peacefully beside the dying embers of their cook fire, unaware that something was terribly wrong with the world. 13 chimes. Church bells didn't ring 13 times, not unless someone or something wanted to send a very specific message. He grabbed his rifle and crept toward the edge of their camp, scanning the moonlit landscape for signs of movement. 3 days had passed since they delivered gold to Maria Torres and her children. 3 days of successful visits to mining families scattered across the Montana wilderness. 3 days of watching hope return to faces that had forgotten what it looked like. But success bred its own dangers. Word was spreading about the convoy carrying gold to miners' widows. Every town they passed through buzzed with whispers and speculation. And whispers had a way of reaching the wrong ears. A shadow moved among the trees 50 yards downhill from their camp. Then another. Ezra counted at least 6 figures, creeping through the darkness, with the careful movements of men who knew how to kill silently. He turned to wake Margaret but found her already sitting up, fully dressed and holding a cocked pistol. Her eyes met his in the moonlight, and she nodded toward the opposite side of camp where more shadows were moving. They were surrounded. Margaret rose silently and moved between the sleeping forms of her men, touching each on the shoulder with a gentle pressure that brought them instantly awake without sound. James Morrison sat up with his rifle already in his hands. Billy Hutchins rolled out of his bedroll and disappeared into the darkness like smoke. Within seconds, every member of their party was awake and armed, responding to the danger with the practiced efficiency of people who'd learned to trust each other completely. But there were only 8 of them against at least 20 attackers. The math wasn't encouraging. Ezra scrawled quickly on his slate. "Too many. Need different plan." Margaret read his words and nodded. A straight fight would get them all killed, but maybe they didn't need to fight at all. Maybe they needed to disappear. She pointed toward a narrow ravine that cut through the hillside behind their camp, barely wide enough for a single coach, but deep enough to provide cover from rifle fire. If they could reach it without being seen, they might be able to escape into the network of canyons that honeycombed this part of the territory. James Morrison crawled over to where the gold coaches stood in a neat line, their precious cargo hidden beneath canvas covers. Getting 6 heavy wagons down a rocky ravine in complete darkness would be nearly impossible, but the alternative was losing everything they'd worked for. "How long?" Margaret whispered, her lips barely moving. James held up 5 fingers, then made a circular motion. 5 minutes to hitch the horses and prepare for movement. It might as well have been 5 hours. The attackers were closing in, moving with military precision through the scattered boulders and pine trees that surrounded the camp. Ezra could make out individual faces now, hard men with the lean look of professional killers. Not random bandits looking for easy prey, but soldiers following orders. Consortium men. They'd found the real convoy at last. Billy Hutchins materialized beside Margaret like a ghost made solid. "Ma'am," he breathed. "There's more coming from the north. Maybe 40 men total, all armed with repeating rifles. 40 against 8. The numbers were getting worse by the minute. "Options?" Margaret asked softly. "Run or fight. Nothing else." "Then we run." Billy nodded and vanished back into the darkness to help James prepare the coaches. Every second counted now. Discovery meant death, and death meant 17 families would never receive the justice they deserved. Ezra checked his pocket watch, a habit left over from his mining days, when precise timing could mean the difference between life and death underground. 3:47 in the morning. Dawn was still hours away, which meant they'd have to navigate treacherous mountain terrain in complete darkness while being pursued by men who knew this country as well as they did. A rifle shot cracked across the valley, followed immediately by Billy's voice. "They're coming!" The careful stealth was over. Now it was a race between desperation and greed, between justice and corruption, between the living and those who would join the dead. "Move," Margaret commanded, abandoning all pretense of silence. The camp exploded into controlled chaos as her men hitched horses to gold-laden coaches with speed born of pure necessity. James Morrison had the lead wagon ready in less than 2 minutes, a feat that should have been impossible but somehow wasn't when lives depended on it. Ezra swung into his saddle and spurred his horse toward the ravine, checking the narrow passage for obstacles that could trap or destroy the heavy coaches. Loose rocks, fallen trees, sudden drop-offs, any of them could end their escape before it began. Behind him, he could hear Margaret shouting orders as the first coach lurched toward the ravine entrance. The iron-reinforced wheels struck stone with sparks and grinding protests, but the vehicle held together and plunged into the narrow passage. More rifle shots echoed from the hillsides as the consortium men realized their prey was escaping. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like deadly fireflies, and bullets whined off rocks close enough to Ezra's head that he could feel their passage. The second coach entered the ravine just as the attackers reached the abandoned campsite. Angry voices called back and forth in the darkness, discussing pursuit options and escape routes. They had numbers and firepower, but Margaret's people had desperation and the intimate knowledge of someone who'd spent weeks studying every possible escape route. "Keep moving," Margaret called from the driver's seat of the third coach. "Don't stop for anything." The ravine twisted like a snake through the hillside, sometimes wide enough for 2 coaches side by side, sometimes so narrow that the iron wheel rim scraped against both walls simultaneously. Tree branches whipped across Ezra's face as his horse picked its way through obstacles that existed more by feel than sight. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. The consortium men had horses too, and they were gaining ground with every passing minute. What had started as a careful escape was becoming a desperate flight through country that could kill them as easily as any bullet. A coach wheel caught on something in the darkness, and the entire vehicle tilted dangerously before righting itself with a crash that echoed off the ravine walls. James Morrison's voice carried clearly through the night air. "Lost some cargo. Coins scattered everywhere." Margaret's response was immediate and harsh. "Leave it. Keep moving." The decision tore at Ezra's heart. Those scattered coins represented food for hungry children, education for the next generation, hope for families who'd had precious little of any of those things. But stopping to collect them would mean capture, and capture would mean losing everything. They plunged deeper into the ravine system, following passages that Ezra remembered from his prospecting days years ago. Natural caves opened like doorways in the rock walls, some leading to underground rivers, others to dead ends that could trap unwary travelers forever. "There," Ezra called, pointing toward a cave entrance that looked large enough to accommodate the coaches. "Hide inside." "Are you sure it's safe?" Margaret called back. Ezra wasn't sure of anything anymore, but the sounds of pursuit were getting closer, and they were running out of ravine to run through. The cave was a gamble, but it was their only chance. One by one, the 6 coaches disappeared into the mountain like gold-laden ghosts, seeking sanctuary in stone. The passage was barely wide enough, and the ceiling scraped against the canvas covers, but somehow they all fit. Darkness swallowed them completely. Outside, the sounds of pursuit swept past their hiding place like a deadly tide. Horses' hooves clattered on stone. Men called to each other in frustrated voices. Rifle shots echoed from distant canyons as the consortium forces spread out to search every possible escape route. But they didn't think to look inside the mountain itself. Margaret's convoy sat in absolute silence, hardly daring to breathe while their enemies searched the countryside outside. The horses seemed to understand the need for quiet, standing motionless in their harnesses, like carved statues waiting for dawn. Hours passed. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter and finally disappeared altogether, leaving only the whisper of wind through stone and the steady drip of water from somewhere deep in the cave system. "I think they're gone," James whispered. "For now," Margaret agreed. "But they'll be back at first light, and they'll search more carefully." Ezra lit a small lantern and studied the cave around them. The passage continued deeper into the mountain, following what looked like an old underground riverbed. If his memory was correct, this system connected to other caves, miles away caves that opened onto completely different valleys where no one would think to look for them. He wrote on his slate, "Can go deeper. Come out different place." "How far?" 10 miles through mountain, maybe 12. Margaret considered the options. Stay here and risk discovery when the consortium men returned. Try to leave the cave and outrun pursuit through open country. Or trust Ezra's memory and navigate 12 miles of underground passages in the hope of emerging somewhere safe. Can the coaches make it? Ezra studied the passage ahead, trying to remember details from explorations he'd made years ago when he was younger and more foolish. The route was dangerous, certainly. There were places where the ceiling dropped low enough to scrape a tall man's head, places where underground streams had carved pits that could swallow a coach and team completely. But it was possible, just barely possible. "With luck," he wrote. Margaret looked around at her tired, frightened crew. They'd been running for hours, fighting exhaustion and terror in equal measure. The smart thing would be to abandon the coaches and escape on horseback, leaving the gold behind to save their lives. But 17 families were counting on them, 17 sets of children who deserved better than the hand life had dealt them. "Then we trust to luck," she said quietly, "and we keep the promise we made to those families." As they prepared to venture deeper into the mountain's heart, Ezra found himself thinking about the impossible sound that had awakened him 13 chimes from a church bell that no longer existed. Maybe it had been the wind playing tricks in the ruins. Maybe it had been his imagination, shaped by stress and exhaustion. Or maybe it had been Samuel Torres and 16 other dead miners, warning him that danger was coming and giving him just enough time to save the justice they died for. Either way, the sound had saved their lives. And now it was up to them to make sure that salvation meant something. The mountain waited ahead, dark and mysterious as a tomb. But somewhere beyond that darkness lay safety. And beyond safety lay 16 more families who deserved to know that their losses hadn't been forgotten. Ezra Blackwood had spent 3 years hiding from the world in guilt and silence. Tonight, he would lead a convoy of justice through the very heart of the earth itself, trusting in memory and hope to guide them toward redemption. The weight of gold had become the weight of responsibility, and he was finally ready to carry it wherever it needed to go. 6 months later, the last family on their list lived in a cabin so remote that even the postal service had given up trying to reach them. Margaret sat beside Ezra on a hillside overlooking the tiny homestead, watching smoke rise from a chimney that suggested life still flickered in this forgotten corner of the Montana Territory. Below them, the final coach from their original convoy waited beside a clear mountain stream, its iron-reinforced wheels bearing the scars of a journey that had transformed them all. "Are you ready for this?" Margaret asked softly. Ezra nodded, though his hands trembled slightly as he cleaned his slateboard. Patrick O'Brien's widow, Catherine, lived in that cabin with her elderly mother-in-law and a newborn son who would never know his father's face. She was the last name on their list, the final family to receive justice for a husband and father stolen by corporate greed. When they were finished here, their mission would be complete. The question that haunted Ezra was what came next. "Tell me about him," Margaret said, sensing his need to talk about the ghost that still followed him. Ezra wrote slowly. Patrick was saving money to bring his mother from Ireland. Talked about it every day. Said she'd never seen mountains like these. He succeeded, didn't he? She's here now. Yes, but not the way he wanted. The old woman had arrived on a cattle boat 6 months after her son's death, carrying nothing but a worn Bible and the address of a daughter-in-law she'd never met. Catherine O'Brien had taken her in despite having nothing herself, and together they'd struggled to survive in a wilderness that seemed determined to break them. Until today. Today, everything changed. Margaret stood and brushed dust from her traveling dress. 6 months of constant movement had worn the fabric thin and faded the color, but she wore it like a badge of honor. They delivered gold to 16 families scattered across 3 territories, and each delivery had been a small victory against forces that seemed too powerful to defeat. "The others are waiting," she said, gesturing toward the stream where James Morrison and Billy Hutchins were watering their horses. The crew that had started this journey was much smaller. Now some men had decided to settle down with families they'd met along the way. Others had found new purposes in towns where former mining widows were using their gold to build better communities. But the core group had stayed together, bound by shared purpose and the understanding that some missions were too important to abandon. Ezra climbed into the driver's seat of the final coach, his movements still careful but no longer hesitant. The months of travel had given him back some of the confidence he'd lost in the mine collapse. Not all of it, he suspected. That wound would never fully heal, but enough to face the world without flinching. The coach wheels turned reluctantly in the soft earth beside the stream, then found purchase on the rocky trail that led to the O'Brien cabin. Birds scattered from their path, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out in a voice that sounded almost like welcome. Catherine O'Brien appeared in her doorway as they approached, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. She was younger than Ezra had expected, maybe 25, with red hair that caught the light and green eyes that held both strength and wariness. A baby rode on her hip, and behind her stood an elderly woman who could only be Patrick's mother. "Mrs. O'Brien?" Margaret called as she dismounted. "I'm Margaret Calloway. We've come about your husband, Patrick." Catherine's expression hardened immediately. "If you're from the mining company, you can turn around and leave. We've heard all the excuses we need to hear." "We're not from the mining company, ma'am. We're here because of what the mining company did to your family." The distinction seemed to penetrate Catherine's defensive armor. She stepped closer, still holding her baby protectively, but her voice carried new interest. "What do you mean?" Ezra climbed down from the coach and approached slowly, his slateboard visible in his hands. When Catherine saw his scarred throat, understanding dawned in her eyes. "You're him," she whispered. "You're the foreman who was in the mine when it collapsed." He nodded and wrote, "I'm sorry about Patrick. He was a good man. Talked about you and the baby every day." Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but she held them back with visible effort. He wrote about you too. Said you cared more about the miners than the mine owners did. Said you'd never let anything happen to them if you could help it. The words hit Ezra like a physical blow, releasing emotions he'd kept carefully controlled for months. Patrick had trusted him. They'd all trusted him. And that trust had been betrayed by forces beyond his control, forces that had finally been brought to justice. Margaret stepped forward with the familiar leather satchel that had become their symbol of hope. "Mrs. O'Brien, your husband died because the Denver Mining Consortium chose profit over safety. They've been held accountable for their crimes, and this belongs to your family." She opened the satchel, revealing the last portion of gold from their original convoy, enough to ensure that Catherine and her son would never go hungry, never wonder where their next meal would come from, never face the world alone and defenseless. Catherine stared at the gold in shock, her baby reaching out tiny fingers toward the gleaming metal. "How much?" "Enough," Margaret said simply. "Enough to honor Patrick's memory and secure your family's future." The elderly woman behind Catherine stepped forward, her Irish accent thick with emotion. "Blessed Mary, Mother of God. Is it real?" "It's real, Mrs. O'Brien," Margaret assured her. "Patrick worked for 5 years to bring you to America. This gold will let you stay here in comfort, and it will ensure your grandson grows up with every opportunity Patrick wanted him to have." Catherine began to cry then, not the bitter tears of grief she'd probably shed for months, but tears of relief and overwhelming gratitude. The baby in her arms gurgled happily, unaware that his future had just been transformed. "I don't know what to say," Catherine whispered. "Say you'll use it well," Margaret replied. "Say you'll tell your son about his father when he's old enough to understand. Say you'll remember that justice sometimes comes slowly, but it comes." As they prepared to leave the O'Brien cabin, Ezra found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 16 families visited, thousands of miles traveled, dangers faced and overcome, men lost and missions completed. But more than that, he'd found something he'd thought was lost forever: purpose. The guilt would always be there, he knew. The memories of 17 good men who died under his watch would never fully fade. But alongside the guilt, he now carried something else: the knowledge that their deaths had not been meaningless. Justice had been served. Families had been saved. The consortium's empire of corruption had crumbled under the weight of evidence and accountability. Margaret walked beside him as they returned to their coach, her face showing the satisfaction of a mission completed against impossible odds. "What will you do now, Ezra?" For the first time in years, he had an answer ready. He wrote on his slate, "Go home. Rebuild the mine. Do it right this time. Prospector's Gulch? New name. New purpose. Safety first, always." Margaret smiled, understanding immediately. "You're going to give other miners the protection Patrick and the others never had." Ezra nodded. "It wouldn't bring back the dead, but it might prevent other families from joining the ranks of the lost and forgotten. It was a way to honor the past while building a better future." As their coach rolled away from the O'Brien cabin, Ezra looked back to see Catherine and her mother-in-law standing in their doorway, holding bags of gold that represented hope made tangible. The baby reached up toward the sky, grasping at clouds with the innocent optimism of someone who would grow up knowing his father had been a hero. Behind them, smoke still rose from the cabin chimney, but now it carried the warmth of security rather than mere survival. The O'Brien family would thrive, as would the 16 others they'd visited along the way. Margaret settled beside him on the coach seat, her own expression peaceful for the first time since he'd met her. "Do you think we've made a difference?" Ezra considered the question as their wheels found the rhythm of the trail home. In his mind, he could see the faces of every family they'd helped: children who would go to school, widows who would own their own land, elderly parents who would spend their final years in comfort rather than want. He wrote on his slate, "We kept our promise. To the families, to the dead." The words carried weight that went beyond their simple meaning. They'd promised 17 dead miners that their sacrifice would matter, that their families would be cared for, that justice would eventually triumph over greed and corruption. Those promises had been kept. As the sun set behind the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold that reminded Ezra of the precious metal they'd carried across 3 territories, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. The weight of gold had become the weight of redemption, and Ezra Blackwood was finally ready to carry it home. Sometimes the measure of a man isn't found in the gold he extracts from the earth, but in the lives he lifts from darkness, including his own. And sometimes, when the cause is just and the heart is willing, even a broken voice can speak loud enough to change the world. The Montana Territory stretched endlessly ahead of them, full of possibilities as bright as the setting sun. Behind them lay the completed mission that had restored hope to 17 families and justice to a corrupt system. And in between, riding the trail toward home, sat a man who had learned that redemption comes not from forgetting the past, but from using it to build a better future for everyone who follows. The gold was delivered. The promise was kept. The story was complete. But the legend of the convoy that carried justice across the American frontier would live forever in the hearts of those who understood that sometimes the most precious treasure isn't what you take from the earth, it's what you give back to the people who need it most.